The crisis that hit a number of countries worldwide in 2008 was basically driven by the same factors. All the countries that were hard hit, including Denmark, were characterized by living through periods where inflation has gone up too far, competitiveness was being eroded, house prices were going to unsustainable level, and too much investments were going into real estate. That was the case in Denmark, that was the case in Spain, Ireland, the Baltic countries. So essentially, the reason for the crisis was too much consumption, too much unsustainable investment. The Lehman Brothers was the triggering effect, but I don't really believe that was a major cause of the crisis. That was the event that triggered the crisis. The countries that were less hard impacted were countries that had managed to do relatively sustainable economic policies. They were not overly investing in real estate. They were not having house booms and so on and so forth. Germany was in fact a country that came relatively quickly out of the crisis, not being into a major investment boom in housing. But I want to add something, that is, some of the countries who were not very hard hit by the crisis, like France, Italy, and even, to say so, Greece, were not very much impacted in 2008 and 2009. But some of those countries who today facing the biggest problems in Europe have in fact now the largest problems. And for me, that is a symbol about the underlying problems behind the low growth in a number of European countries: weak productivity, weak functioning labor markets, and so on and so forth. The ECB in early 2015 initiated the so-called quantitative easing program, buying up securities. That may stimulate growth, but also has some risk. One clear risk is that it will lead to new financial bubbles. An indication of that is when you look at the prices of equities relative to GDP. For countries like the United States, who have done quantitative easing for some years, we're already back to levels about 2007. That's not the case in Europe, but we are certainly seeing levels of equity prices that may be so high as to actually initiate new financial bubbles. So there's a risk here. One thing that Europe has to recognize is demographics. In a number of countries in Europe, the working age population is no longer increasing. In fact, countries like Italy and Spain have basically almost no growth in the working age population. So demographic is clearly playing against growth. I think on the positive side is that Europe has huge potential for growth, basically in the same countries. Why? Because they are the ones who have the most to do in structural reforms, they have most to do in pension reforms, they have most to do in labor market reforms. So for these countries, not only do they still have a lot of spare capacity they can bring down, but they can also increase the potential of the economies quite considerably by implementing reforms. Growth and reforms to drive growth will of course also be a factor that can increase Danish exports. And the important thing is, of course, that growth in the countries that we're exporting a lot to are more important than countries that are not so important. We are exporting most to Germany, Sweden, and United Kingdom. For these countries, we already see that they don't have a lot of spare capacity. So the growth we can have from these countries from reducing spare capacity is very low. What we can hopefully see is more growth to Sweden and United Kingdom, simply coming from that they have relatively good productivity performance and their working age population is also increasing. At the other end, we have countries like Austria, France, Finland, Ireland, basically Southern Europe. We export not nearly as much to these countries. On the other hand, the actual potential for these countries closing the output gap is much larger. And these countries also have more potential from growing through labor market reforms. We think that there are still things that can be done actually to encourage risk-taking investments in the smaller segment of the Danish business sector. And if you look at the Capital Market Union proposal by the Commission, it's exactly about this. In Europe and in Denmark, we have a system whereby funds to businesses are basically going through the banking system. And that is fine because firms need credit, but they also need risk capital, they need equity. And the analysis from the Commission is that European firms need more equity, they need more risk capital. And there's a strong evidence that the firms that came best out of the payment crisis were those who had most equity, who had most sustainable medium-term financing. So I think that's the right priority. It's the right priority for Europe, and it's the right priority for Denmark.